Hey guys, and welcome to another very exciting visual effects tutorial where I'm going to show you how to melt someone's face. Now, you probably noticed the Intel hashtag in the top corner of the video. Intel are showcasing their latest i7 processors and 750 series SSDs to visual effects artists and video creators, and you can check out what you can do with their top-of-the-line hardware by going to vfxcreator.intel.com. On this site you will also find links to Intel partners offering custom-built digital content creation systems, and I'm going to put that link for you guys down in the description of the video. As part of this initiative, Intel sent me a fully spec'd out PC to try and to keep, and to talk a little bit about my experience with the computer as part of this tutorial. The machine they sent me is a real beast, and it comes loaded with 64 GB of DDR4 RAM, 2 GTX 1080 graphics cards, a 6 TB backup drive, and at the heart of the system, two 400 GB Intel 750 series SSDs, which are using the new NVMe technology, which promises to be about 5 times faster than what you can do with regular SATA, and an Intel i7-6950X Extreme Edition CPU, which comes with a massive 10 cores and 20 threads. So yes, I am being paid for this video in the form of techie nerdy goodness, but no, this is not an actual Intel ad. I will absolutely talk about my own personal experience with the computer, primarily focused on the new i7 CPU and the 750 series SSDs, and tell you exactly what I like and what I don't like about it. Anywho, that probably took enough of your time. Let's finally jump into the tutorial and melt someone's face off. Welcome to the wonderful world of Adobe After Effects, and the project I have here is the project for the short film at the beginning of this video. This effect right here, the face melt, is the primary visual effect that I wanted to create as part of this project. For one, I'm a huge fan of Raiders of the Lost Ark, which this whole short film, in case it wasn't blatantly obvious, is based on. Secondly, creating this effect was well beyond my skill level, and so I figured it would force me to learn some 3D skills and figure out how to do fluid simulation and some of the more advanced visual effects that I've been wanting to do. And finally, due to the sheer amount of visual effects and especially the complexity of this face melting effect, I figured it would be a really good test for this PC that Intel had sent me. As you can see, this project included quite a large number of visual effect shots, and each of them was pretty involved, but I was pretty surprised how well the PC held up. Now, unfortunately, Adobe After Effects does not really make much use of the GPU, so the graphics card didn't really add much to my workflow in Adobe After Effects, but the CPU itself, just for processing all of the effects, really helped out, and obviously a huge amount of RAM just makes it really easy to cache the whole thing into memory. Like, for example, this whole face melt effect right here, start to end, is just all cached in memory. Obviously, when you don't have all of this data cached, for example, let me come into Edit, Purge, and purge all of my memory. The new i7-6950X CPU still has to do a fair amount of thinking, but it's definitely a whole lot quicker than my old one, which is the Intel 4790K, the Devil's Canyon, which is by no means a bad CPU. The biggest benefit of the 6950X processor I felt was much more in the multitasking capabilities. For example, I could be exporting something from Adobe Media Encoder and still be editing in Premiere Pro smoothly, or work on visual effects in After Effects, or do some work on Houdini and watch something on the side without any real problem. The 6950X has 10 cores and 20 threads, which is a whole lot more than my old one, and that I do have to say I definitely noticed, especially since this project was pretty involved and it included a whole lot of different software packages to put it all together. In terms of the Intel 750 series SSDs, I felt the main benefit was when I was actually working with 4K footage. This face melt composition, for example, includes a couple of the super high quality fire elements from the Action VFX collection, which are about 1 to 2 gigabytes each, and my old computer would really struggle with these to the point where I would end up rendering out proxy elements just to work with them properly. And my old computer does have SSD drives as well, but they are using SATA 3 instead of the new NVMe technology. So again, I'm actually quite impressed with the Intel 750 series drives. In terms of just pulling in large data off your drive and just getting it into After Effects so you can work with them, it did a pretty good job. But that's enough babbling, let's look at how we can create this cool 3D face melting effect, and for that we are going to use a program called Houdini. Welcome to Houdini. Now, there are tons of reasons why I ended up choosing Houdini as my weapon of choice and for creating this particular visual effect, and I will talk about all of those in due time. Houdini is a really powerful procedural 3D animation package that is starting to become more and more heavily used in the visual effects industry. And what is even more awesome is you can come over to sideeffects.com, which is the company that produces Houdini, come over to get and download, and you can download Houdini for free. It's called Houdini Apprentice, you can install it and use it, just not for commercial purposes, and it's available for Windows, OS X and Linux. So once you've downloaded and installed Houdini, you should have no problems following along with this tutorial. And this is the final setup for my face melt effect. And if I jump through this, it'll take a second for Houdini to update because it has to recalculate the surface of the particles. This does not usually go this fast. Scrubbing through your timeline in Houdini works a little bit different, especially if there's physics involved, because they have to be calculated from the first frame through. But what I have done is I have essentially cached out, just like in After Effects when you pre-render something, it caches it to memory. I have cached out all of my simulation data. I have a folder here where I've cached out all of my particles. So all of these particles here that make up the fluid that's kind of running down my face, I have essentially cached that out to my hard drive. And there's 240 frames. And let's check this out. Yep, it's 136 gigabytes. And this is just simulation data. This is just the physics simulation data cached out to disk that Houdini needs to render the final image. On the new Intel machine, caching all of this data out took about 13-14 hours, and then the final render itself was another 7-8 hours on top of that. Obviously, the reason these files are so huge and it took so long, even on the new machine, is because I was using 10 million particles to simulate the fluid effect. For this tutorial, we're going to use a whole lot less particles, but obviously the quality is going to be a little lower. And then if you want to do your final render, you just pump up the particles and let your computer do your thing. In case you are already familiar with Houdini and you just want to melt some stuff, I'm going to include a download link to the final project file in the description of the video, so you can download that and replace the model and melt whatever you want and just customize it to your liking. But that was enough talking. Hopefully you're psyched for this tutorial, so let's get started and go to File, New. Yep, let's discard everything and start from scratch. This is a brand new empty project, and if you've never seen Houdini before, the main UI features are a 3D viewport on the left. On the right you have your elements or your items in the scene, and you can select them here and create new elements in here. At the top you've got all of the properties of your currently selected element. By default it has selected my camera in the scene, so I have absolutely nothing in here yet. And at the very top you have a whole bunch of options to create a huge amount of different elements, and you can apply all sorts of dynamics like particles, rigid bodies, explosions, fluids, smoke, pyro effects for fire and explosions, everything inbuilt in Houdini. So we are going to use a few of they call them shelf tools, to build our effect. But now let's start first off by importing the model of my face and applying the texture. To create geometry in Houdini, come down into your object view. So if that's not selected, make sure you're on object. So this is all the elements in your scene. And then I'm going to press Tab and then simply type geometry. And there it is. I can create a new geometry node. So I'm going to drop that down. Now, Houdini is node-based. So if you haven't worked with a node-based tool before, this might be quite different and maybe a little bit jarring, but hopefully it'll also be exciting because there's some really cool stuff you can do in Houdini. So I've got an empty geometry node here. So this is just a little bit of a placeholder in my scene. And I'm going to call this one Tobias Face. Let's dive into this node by double-clicking it. So we're going to essentially dive into the network of this geometry node. So double-click it. And then we're here in a network that describes the geometry for this object. By default, a new geometry node will have a file node in it that you can use to load some geometry. And you'll notice that at the top, you now can see the properties of the selected file node. This little yellow outline here indicates that it's selected. And here you can see the geometry file is specified to be default.bgeo, whatever you actually call this, and that's your default cube. So what I'm going to do is up in here, I'm going to go over to the right and click on this picker. This will bring up the file dialog, and I'm going to dive into my GEO or geometry folder. And in here, I've got a model for tobiasface.obj. And as I said, you can download these files from a link in the description of the video if you want to follow along. So I'm just going to double click that to import it into my scene. And now if I hold Alt and scroll on my mouse wheel, I can zoom in and out and drag around. So there it is, my squished up head. Now, I keep on saying that I'm absolutely no good at 3D modeling, and so I did not create this head. I actually got my brother Nils to create it for me, so thank you very much. So he created this model of my head for me, and he also mapped the texture to it that we're going to apply. In order to apply a texture in Houdini, we first have to create a material. In order to do that, on the right side, you will find the material palette. So you can click on that, and it'll bring you into the material view where you can create and modify your materials. You will find in Houdini there's lots and lots of different views of the same elements. So the material palette is one way to view your materials. I like to work with this one. It's quite nice and easy and very visual. So in here on the left-hand side, you have a bunch of materials that you can essentially reuse and modify. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to drag this mantra surface from the left side over into my right-hand side and drop it in. And it has this shop icon. This means shader operations. For Houdini, you'll find lots of little acronyms like VOP, SOP, DOP, POP, SHOP. SHOP means shader operator. So in here, you will find all of your materials. So we have now created a new surface called Mantra Surface. And if you're wondering why it's called Mantra, Mantra is the default renderer that comes inbuilt with Houdini. We're going to use that to render our scene. It's really powerful. It's really good. I really enjoy using it. So we now have a Mantra Surface. And to this, we now need to apply our texture. In order to do that, you may have noticed with the Mantra Surface selected, at the top I can see my properties for the Mantra Surface. And I'm on the surface Diffuse. There's lots and lots of tabs here for bumps, displacements, reflections, codes, refraction, subsurface scattering, all sorts of cool stuff. So I want to go to Surface and Diffuse. So this is just defining the diffuse color of my texture. Scroll down a little bit, and here under Color, I want to actually say use a map, use a texture map. So I'm going to click that. This is going to enable my texture map settings. And then in the map property on the right hand side, I'm going to click the file selector again. I'm going to move out of my geo folder and into my text folder or texture folder. And in here I have one called Tobias Face Unwrapped.jpg. So this is the texture map that we're going to apply to my face. So double click that to bring it in. You may wonder why the material still shows all gray, and that's because we haven't re-rendered it. So in order to re-render your materials with their current settings, you actually have to press this little refresh button here at the top of your material palette. So click that one. And well, it's a bit hard to see, but essentially it's the texture. And the way to find out whether this is actually properly working, you can simply take this material from your material palette and drag it over directly into your viewport onto my ugly head. Let go. Houdini will pop up a number of options. Don't worry about them too much for now. Simply select Assign Shader to Head_collapsed and click on that. And there you go. You now have a texture on my face. You may notice that it is way too shiny though. I'm sweating profusely, or I'm wrapped in Glad wrap or something. It's way too shiny. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure my Mantra Surface is selected in my material palette. I'm going to come up a little bit. I'm going to go to Reflect Base, so Surface, Reflect Base, and I'm going to disable all of the reflections because it just doesn't fit with my skin. So that looks a whole lot better. Also, what I'm going to do is at the very top here is the name of my Mantra Surface. So let's call this one Tobias Skin, because Mantra Surface doesn't really mean much to you once you have a bunch of materials. Always give them good names. So now we have a textured head, which is kind of cool. So let's start melting it. The very first thing I want to do before I start turning this into liquid is I want to create a ground plane, like a solid ground plane that the liquid can drop onto, otherwise it's going to fall down into nothingness. In order to do that, let's come back to our object view, and you may wonder, where did it just go? Well, we're in the material palette. 2 over on the left, you will see /shop, or you can also go to your tree view if you wanted to. You can check these out in your own time. There's a whole bunch of tutorials online, highly recommended. So I'm going to come back to shop. This is all of my shade operators, and here I've got my Tobias skin. And remember how I said you often see the same things in different views? So this is essentially the same view of what you see in the material palette. This is the Tobias skin element. It's just a different view of it. But up here in the top on this drop down, I'm going to change it over from shop back to object. So this is going to bring us back into our scene. And there's our geometry again, Tobias face. In order to create a ground plane, I'm going to come up into my toolbar. Up over on the right hand side, the 4th one from the left is going to be rigid bodies. So I'm going to go into the rigid bodies tab and simply click on ground plane. This is going to create a ground plane object. So here it is. If, by the way, you can't see all of your nodes, and it's created a whole bunch of other nodes, if you can't see them, simply with this view selected, press L and it will lay out all of the nodes in your scene. So sometimes when you're missing something, just press L to make sure you have them all in your view. I'm actually going to rename ground plane object simply to ground. So this one here is our ground, and you can actually toggle this little blue icon on the right hand side for visibility, so you can turn it off or on so we can see our ground plane. I'm going to leave it on for now. And the other thing that clicking on the ground plane button has created as well in Houdini is an auto DOP network. Now this sounds terribly complicated, and it kind of is, but it's also actually kind of cool. It automatically created a DOP network, a dynamics operation network. So in here we will find all of the elements that essentially deal with the physics in Houdini or in our particular scene. While Houdini is massively complex, one of the things I really like about it is that everything is inbuilt. You don't need plugins for physics or destructions or fire or smoke or fluid simulation. Everything is inbuilt. It's all available in Houdini, and the way it deals with the rigid body physics that we've just set up is it creates an auto DOP network. And if we jump into that, so just double click onto this auto DOP network, again you can see there's more nodes up there. Press L to lay them all out, and well, if that didn't work too well, you can press H as well to see all of them. Now this is getting a bit tiny. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So L and H, just lie them out a little bit. And there's a whole bunch of nodes that have been created for you, and they're all connected. So as I said, Houdini is node-based. So through here we have a ground plane. So this is our actual ground plane. It goes through a merge, a static solver, a merge, a gravity, and an output. Now this may be quite a bit to take in, and I'm not going to go over all of it. Essentially we have a ground plane node that represents the physics of our ground plane. That goes through a static solver, which deals with static geometry or static rigid bodies. So this is kind of the brains of the operation. And then it goes through a few other things, and then a gravity. So this applies standard gravity to any elements in your scene. And then it just simply gets output, and it kind of flows back into the pipeline and applies to all of the object in your scene. So we now have all of that set up. Now let's not spend too much time in here. Let's get back up to the object view, and at the top here you can see that we're inside the auto DOP network. We're inside object, and within object we're in auto DOP network. This is kind of like a browser. This is like, links like from one to the next, and you can click on these to get back up. So for example, let's say I want to return to the OBJ level. I can just click on this and I'm returned to the top level. Now let's finally melt stuff. Click anywhere in your object view to make sure nothing is selected, and then come up into the top toolbar and find the Viscous Fluid tab. In here, there's a whole bunch of cool stuff you can do. You can create lava if you wanted to. Really cool stuff. So we're going to click on Melt Object. Now at the bottom, it's going to tell me select an object to melt, and then press Enter to complete. And I want to select my head, so make sure you have my head selected. Click, and then press Enter. And Houdini is going to turn my head into a bunch of fluid particles. It also has in our auto DOP network, this is the auto DOP network or the dynamics network that I've shown you earlier. So in here, let's press L to untangle this spaghetti mess. In here, remember our ground plane and the static solver and the gravity. Cool, so this we already know. It's added a whole bunch of new things. It's essentially added a flip fluid object, which is essentially a fluid object. This is essentially my head. It's added a flip solver, which is a fluid solver. It works essentially the same as the solver for static geometry and static rigid bodies, but this one works on fluids because obviously we want to melt stuff, and melting things usually is liquid. And it also added another node called gas temperature update. Now we get to this a little bit later when we control how this object melts. For now we don't actually need to worry too much about this. What I'm going to do instead, I'm going to come up into my object view. I am going to disable the visibility on the ground plane by clicking on this little blue icon here, so that I see only my head. I can kind of rotate around it. So yep, it's kind of in the shape of a head. And then I'm going to make sure I'm at the beginning of my timeline. Come over all the way to the right hand side. There's like a little stopwatch icon here. And this is quite important. It's essentially make sure that playback will be real time, because Houdini will process and playback things as fast as it can, or as fast as your computer can handle. So make sure you enable real time playback and then press play. Now that actually played back pretty fast and it wasn't sped up or anything, that was real time. Because I wanted to see how well the new computer that Intel sent me would perform in comparison to my old machine, I actually ran Houdini with the same scenes and the same style of simulations on my old machine first. My old machine was struggling, especially once I scaled up the resolution for some, more detailed fluids and some more detailed simulations. My old one was really struggling. RAM was always being maxed out and the CPU kind of just, everything just kind of chugged down. On the new machine, it's not butter smooth, but it is a lot better. Like the 10 cores really help out. Although I do have to say that especially Houdini tends to just eat all of my CPU. It literally just pushes it up to 95. But I can still run simulations and do After Effects and Premiere next to each other. That worked quite well. Or render something out through Houdini and still use After Effects and Premiere. So just be aware that when you're running through simulations in Houdini, especially on high resolutions, it might just get really slow depending on what machine you have, depending on how much RAM you have. Anyways, now that we have my head turned into sticky goo, one of the cool things we can do is we can add other physics elements into the scene and they will all interact with one another. So what I can do is let's create a box so that the head essentially just liquefies on top of a box. In order to do that, come up to the toolbar and up here there's the box tool. And what I like to do is I like to hold down Ctrl and click and it will create a box in my scene automatically. So hold down Ctrl, click on the box and it'll create a new box for you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to press T to select the move tool and let's drag the box up a little bit. In my network view, I'm going to make sure my box object is selected. Let's pull this down a little bit and up here are all the properties for my box object. So I've got my geometry selected up here. Maybe let's scale this up to 2 by 2 by 2. Maybe let's move this down again a little bit so it's just like a pedestal for my head essentially. And if I play this back now, the box doesn't interact with my fluid yet. So let's rewind. With the box selected, I'm simply going to come up into the shelf tools up here on the top right hand side. There's rigid bodies, so go into the rigid bodies tab and simply click on static object to make this box a static rigid body. So let's click that. You won't see anything right here, but if you dive into the Autodop network, you will see that the box is now added to this physics simulation in here. So if we dive into the Autodop network and again lay all of this out, there it is at the top. Again, I'm just going to make this a bit bigger so you can see it. So there's the box next to the ground plane. There's static objects, so going through the static solver. Let's return back to object level. Let's hide the box because I don't actually want to see it. I'm going to rewind. I'm going to play back my scene. And you will notice that the little blue bar here has gone. So the cache got invalidated and it's going to have to resimulate and recalculate all of the physics involved. So let's just play this back. Cool, I'm not sure you can see this. So my head is now essentially liquefying on top of this cube. So it's an invisible cube. Maybe I'll turn the visibility back on. So it's kind of liquefying right on top of it, which looks pretty cool. So now we turned my head into fluid and we've simulated the scene. However, my head doesn't really melt as it just liquefies and spills all over the place. What I want to do is essentially I want this head to stand up by itself. I don't want it to liquefy at all. I want it to kind of be stiff and viscous and just stick together until I use another object to essentially melt pieces of it away at my control. In order to do that, let's dive into the Autodop network. And again, in here, you'll have a whole bunch of different things, and there's our head. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm actually going to increase the resolution a little bit because I find it's a little bit hard to see what is actually going on. And in order to do that, you can come into your flip fluid object. And up here at the top, you will find something called particle separation. So this essentially defines the space, the gap between your particles. If we bring this down from 0.1 to 0.05, you will suddenly have a whole lot more particles in your scene and the head will be much more defined. Let's maybe bring this further down to 0.02. And wow, that's quite a lot of particles. Let's zoom out. And what I'm going to do is I'm essentially going to simulate this again. So again, the cache has been cleared, so we lost our blue bar because we changed our properties in the network. Let's go back to the beginning and let's play this back. You will notice that this has gotten quite a bit slower, and at the bottom here you'll find little notices about how it's cooking. So this is essentially processing, and the stronger your CPU is, the quicker this will run, because most of this is done directly on your CPU. So a strong CPU will definitely get you a long way with doing this sort of work. Although, quite honestly, most of the time you would probably keep this at a fairly low resolution, like a high particle separation, and simulate this as a low resolution first until you're pretty much ready to render this out, and then you ramp up all the parameters and let it run overnight or over the week or the fortnight or however long your computer takes to really crunch through this. Obviously, a smaller particle separation means more particles and more detail in the actual simulation, so you can see a little bit better what it'll actually look like in the end. So, like on my old PC, again, sometimes when you simulate it with very low resolutions, you may not actually really get a feel for what the effect looks like. So you kind of have to find a nice middle ground. The new CPU is much beefier than my old one. It really helps with all of the calculations. Ooh, but I think we can't hold quite that much in my cache. So I'm actually going to scrub through. Let's check this out. But you get an idea of how the head is now melting. I think it's a bit too much for the demo purposes. So I'm actually going to bring this back to 0.05. And let's play this back. Yeah, cool. I think this is much better just for the tutorial, so you don't have to sit there and wait for it being simulated all the time. Kind of a cool effect already. But now, let's add some viscosity, some thickness to our fluid so it doesn't just liquefy all at once. So again, in the flip fluid object, which you probably still have selected, if you come down, you'll find a property for viscosity, and this is the thickness. And one of the cool things about Houdini, you can just hover over these properties and it'll explain exactly what it means and what it does. Now, obviously, you will always have to resimulate once you change these parameters, but let's jack up the viscosity of this fluid to something absolutely insane, like, let's make it 1,000,000. That's about as viscous as it can get. So this is essentially, hardened jelly or something that, wouldn't really liquefy. Make sure you're at the beginning of the timeline, and let's play this back to simulate. And, well, nothing happens, but we're not really expecting anything. We essentially turned our liquid solid. The reason you can see it go red a little bit on the outside is because the liquid is cooling down over time, and the cooler it gets, the more viscous it gets, so it kind of hardens over time as well. So it starts turning this really solid red, which is just an implication that, it's cold on the outside. On the inside, it's still a little bit more warm and a little bit more fluid. Now let's create an object that essentially radiates heat, and then we can animate and move through the head or along the head to essentially melt off bits and pieces. For that, I'm going to come back up into my object view, so out of the Adobe network, go up. You can either click this, also just in the view, you can just press U for up, and it'll essentially take you out, which is a little bit easier. Let's press L to lay this out. And let's create a sphere. So what I'm going to do, again, with nothing selected, simply press Tab to bring up the little drop-down menu. You can either type it up here and here, or you can come down to Geometry, because any object you want to import into your scene will always have to reside in a node, so in a geometry node. So let's drop that in here. Let's call this one Melt Sphere or Heat Sphere or something, and let's jump into that. By default, Houdini will expect us to import a file, but we don't have a file for the sphere, so I'm going to delete this file node altogether. And in here on the left, you can also see that I can still see the shaded outline of all of the other elements I have in my scene. That's just kind of assisting you to create your object relative to where all of the other elements are in your scene. If you don't want that, at the top of the viewport, you actually have a little drop down here where you can say, show all object, ghost other objects, which is what we're doing right now. So we're seeing a transparent version of them. Or you can come down and hide them. I'm just going to leave them ghosted for now, but just so you know how to turn this off. Anyways, inside our Melt Sphere geometry node, let's go Tab and type Sphere, and let's drop down a sphere. So I'm just going to drop down a sphere right there. Pretty big. Let's zoom out a little bit. But I think this might actually work. Technically, you can move and animate this node. However, the procedural nature of Houdini kind of recommends you do this in a flow, in a network, so you don't modify the original object. You kind of use transforms to move things around. So what you can do is in this network, and this is kind of cool, click on this little button at the bottom here. So click once, and you essentially, it's wanting you to connect to something else. In this mode, you can create a new node, and a new node that you create will automatically be connected in a flow. So let's press Tab with this little wiggly thing hanging out. Press Tab and type Transform. So we want to add a transform node. Let's select this one and drop it down. So we're now creating a sphere, and then we're applying a transform to it. In order to see what this transform does, right now I'm visualizing the sphere. So even if I was to scale my sphere down or move it, for example, let's change the translate to 4. The gizmo has moved, but the sphere is still here because I'm still viewing my original sphere. In order to view my transform and what happens to my sphere at this point in time, I have to enable this. And now you can see the sphere there. And let's also select it so the gizmo moves with it. And again, just one of those fundamentals of Houdini that I will cover in a later tutorial. I really want to get into Houdini, some cool stuff you can do, but there's so much to it. So for now, just follow along. So we now have our sphere transformed. With our transform selected, I can essentially move this sphere. And what I want to do is I'm essentially going to move it across the front of my face, just melt off the front of my face, like my nose and my eyes. For that, I'm going to move it in position. So I'm going to kind of drag it in position at the front side of my face. So let's line this up as best as we can so I can just push it through essentially. So that looks good. Let's go back to frame 0 or frame 1 and let's create a keyframe for this position. So with the transform node selected and view enabled, come into translate and simply hold down Alt and left click on the translate. This will mark these fields as green and it will create a keyframe. Let's move forward to, let's say, keyframe 48. Let's move the sphere across my face over to the other side, to about here. And the little beige field tells you this value has been changed, but you haven't actually saved this change yet. So again, let's create a keyframe at this position in time. Hold down Alt and left click on Translate. Now we've created a new keyframe, and if we scrub through, you can see the sphere kind of moves along the front of my face through the particles, and that's essentially what we're going to melt off this mesh. Let's come back up to the object level. Let me press L to lay it out and H to, I don't know, home in on all of them. It essentially just shows you all of them at once. So this is essentially now our scene. So we've got the sphere moving across. And what I want to do is I essentially want to turn this sphere into a hot object that then melts away my face. In order to do that, come back up to the toolbar and go over to the Viscous Fluid tab. So let's click on that. And in here you have an item called Heat Within Object. So this will turn an object into a hot object that can melt viscous fluids. So with our sphere selected, let's click Heat Within Object. Now I'm being asked to select the fluid object to heat. And the fluid object I want to heat is the fluid object we created for my head. So I want to essentially click on my head. And the reason all of this has changed is because it has actually dropped us down into object auto network and it has selected the flip fluid object, and that is the fluid object for my face. So that's the correct one to select. So you can click on that and make sure you've got it selected. And now all we have to do is, well, press enter to complete. Let's do that. Okay, so my sphere turned into like this little blobby cloud. And what actually happened is that the sphere's still there. That hasn't really changed. But inside the auto network, if we jump back into that, so double click on that, inside here, again, it's turning into a bit of a spaghetti mess, but you'll get used to this. Not the mess, but dealing with it. So press L to lay it out and H to zoom all the way out. And let me make this a little bit bigger, because otherwise this is going to start getting a bit hard to see. So what we now have is, you remember the ground plane, the box, our fluid object, the gas temperature update. You now have a new object called a heating volume. And this heating volume essentially represents the sphere as it moves across. So what's going to happen is that this element essentially takes care of the heat transmission from your sphere across over to all of these fluid elements. And if I play this back now, what I might do is I might come up to the object level first and disable the visibility on the sphere, because I don't actually want to see it, but I think I'm going to turn on the visibility on the ground so I can always see all of my static geometry, but the heat sphere I shouldn't see. It's just going to move across my face. Let's make this a little bit bigger so we can see what's going to happen. And let's play this back. You can see the particles turning white here means they're being heated up, they're getting hot. And what you can see just a little bit, let's see if I can rotate around while this is simulating. That's a little bit slow. You can see my nose is coming off. I'm starting to melt. Now you can see that this is a little bit slow to simulate even on my new i7 6950X, and this isn't even a resolution that I would use for rendering this out. This is still just trying it out, although I may lower the resolution a little bit for our next run just to make this a bit quicker. But let me just speed this video up just so we don't have to sit through the simulation process. And now that it's simulated, you can see the effect of my face being melted away by that sphere. Now, it's not as liquid as I want it to be. It just kind of droops my nose and my upper lip down a little bit. Towards the end of the simulation, you can see some of the particles turning yellow and orange again. They're cooling down, they're essentially hardening again into the viscous blob of fluid that we have. But there are a ton of properties that you can tweak to customize this in any way you want. All of them you will find inside the Adobe network. The first thing I might do is I might actually first select my flip fluid object and come up into the settings at the very top, particle separation. Let's bring this back up to like 0.1, just so that we can actually simulate this a little bit quicker. Let's go back to the beginning. So just so that for other tries I can run this through a bit quicker and show you. So there's my head. Let me move these panels over just a little bit. And now there are a number of different properties that you can tweak to kind of see what the effects are on your simulation. For one, in the flip fluid object itself, at the bottom, obviously you can tweak the viscosity. You can make your fluid overall, like everything, a little bit less thick. So maybe let's try 100,000. Rewind and play this back. And this is going to simulate quite a bit quicker now because we have less particles. And you can see quite a bit more of my face is coming off there. Obviously, we don't have quite as much resolution anymore. And then at the bottom, you can see the liquid hardening here. It's kind of stiffening up as it runs down. Let me press escape to abort the simulation. Otherwise, we're going to have to sit through the whole thing. Other things you can modify are in the gas temperature update. This is the node that essentially takes care of cooling down your particles and diffusing the temperature. And up here, for example, you can define the cooling rate, which is the speed at which your particles in the simulation slow down and stiffen again. So for example, let's drop down the outer cooling rate to 0.1, and I'm expecting the particles to remain hot and liquid for a little bit longer, so not stiffen so quickly, just keep running for a little bit more. Let's go back to the beginning of our sequence and let's simulate that. Cool, so you can see the particles spilling down here, and they kind of just keep running for a little bit longer than they did before. So that looks pretty cool. You can also, in the gas temperature update, come down, there's, temperature diffusion or the minimum and maximum viscosity that your liquid is going to have, or how much defines what is solid and what's not. So you can tweak these and resimulate. It takes a lot of time. Like after a while, simulating these things and trying all the different settings and then potentially doing a test render takes huge amount of time. I've done probably about 6 test renders now, all overnight. Anyway, I digress. The last thing that you can change is over in the heating volume. And this, remember, in the heating volume, let me come back to object level and turn our melt sphere back on. So this is our heating volume. This is essentially the volume that is heating up this liquid. If I jump back into the Adobe network and reselect the heating volume, up in here, this is essentially the element that transfers the heat onto my face. So down in here at the bottom, you can actually specify the range, the rates increases and other ranges of temperature transfer. So for example, I can make this a lot hotter. For example, I can say my rate increase is 5 or my output range is 1 to 2. So the heat is a lot more burning on the face. It's a lot hotter when it gets transferred. So again, let's just simulate this and see what happens. Let's come back and play this back. Whoa, can you see how quickly all of that falls off? Like it really liquefies. It doesn't just slowly melt, it just liquefies. So that's kind of really quickly just kind of rub and it just turns into liquid straight away. So again, this is kind of stuff you can play with and try out. Now, one of the things I really love about Houdini, but also one of the things that kind of makes it require a pretty beefy PC to run at higher resolutions, is the fact that absolutely everything is procedural. This means that at any point in time, you can change anything about your scene. For example, right now we just have this sphere melting the front of my face, but we can just go back to the beginning and we can change this heating volume. We can just add something new into it. For example, let's come back into the object level, return to my melt sphere, and I don't remember this stuff here. I just remember having this sphere, but there's now some other thing. Oh, transform, I remember. We had the transform set up, but there's a few other things that Houdini has set up when we turned this into a heating object. What I essentially did to create the actual face melt from the intro is I had a face model, but I had multiple volumes all around it and they kind of enclosed in on the face from the outside to melt the model from the outside. And the way we can easily do that is we can essentially make multiple spheres that kind of animate around this face to kind of just melt it from the outside in. Now, we're not going to go quite that far, but let's at least add another sphere that melts a different part of this head. For that, let's select the sphere and the transform, so both of those. Copy them, Ctrl C. Make sure nothing's selected, Ctrl V to paste them in. So now we have a second sphere. Make sure that the display flag is on the second transform. So this is essentially our second sphere. So that's selected. And here in little green, I'm not sure you can see this on the recording, there's two little green bars indicating where the keyframes lie. So in the first keyframe, I'm essentially going to move the sphere back. I'm just going to essentially melt the back of my head as well. So probably about here. And I'm going to melt it from the other side. So I've just repositioned my sphere on the back of my head and lining it up. And keyframe should already be saved, but you can always Alt and left click on Translate to make sure. Let's move forward to the next keyframe, and you can actually use these little buttons here with the arrow green. So this will jump you to the next keyframe on your selected object. Let's move the sphere. And Houdini took a second because it needed to recalculate what your scene was going to look like at frame 48. So let's move the sphere across to the other side, so to about here. And let's create another keyframe. Make sure all of that is green so that this one now has another piece of animation. And what I want to do is I want to essentially combine these two spheres into the one temperature object, into this one object that heats. And I can do that with a merge node. So what I want to do is I want to create a merge node in here. So make sure nothing is selected, press Tab, and then simply start typing merge. And I'm looking for a merge node, which will essentially combine geometry into one piece. So I'm going to select my merge node, make sure the display flag is on. I'm not going to see anything at all, like none of my spheres, because nothing's connected. First, I'm going to come over this connection here between my transform and the temperature source and right click it and select disconnect to disconnect this node. And now I'm going to click on this little bottom pin of my transform 1 node and connect that to the top of my merge. So I'm merging in sphere 1, and there's our sphere 1. We can now see it because we're seeing everything in this merge node. And I'm going to take the bottom pin of my transform 2, which is my second sphere, remember, and connect it to the top of my merge node. And now I can see both spheres. It's a little slow now dragging through it because I have to resimulate. So there's my two spheres. And now, well, Houdini gives me a whole bunch of red because it tells me, well, nothing's connected here, I don't know what to do. So what we still need to do is at the bottom of the merge. So the output of the merge node, which is both of our spheres, now goes at the top of the create temperature source. So now, if I click these ones, they'll turn back to normal. And if I click on the little display at out temperature, I can now see two volumetric spheres. And these are now both heating this object in the same way. So now, let's come back out to the object level, rewind our sequence, and I'm actually going to hide my melt sphere because I don't actually want to see it. I just want to see the effect itself. Let's scroll in a little bit. And I might actually increase the resolution again a little bit. So let's come into the Auto-Dop network, reselect the flip fluid object, which is the fluid that represents your head. And at the top of the parameters, you'll find the particle separation. Let's just bump this up quite a bit. I want to kind of see this effect, and we're going to get a little bit to rendering in a second. So let's bump this up to 0.01. Again, not sure how well your computer will handle that. It does need quite a bit of computational power. Let's jump back up to the object level, go back, and let's start simulating. Down here at the bottom, you can actually see the time it takes. Let's see how long this takes. I don't want you to sit there forever. Now, this is taking a little bit too long, even on my fancy new CPU. It's taking about 30 seconds to a minute per frame, and it's going to take a little bit too long to simulate for this tutorial. And if you actually want to know how many particles you have in your scene at any point in time, you can actually come into the Tobias face fluid or whatever underscore fluid element that Houdini created for you. You can jump into that, and it'll just have a DOP import from your dynamics processing. It'll just import all of the physics data back into it, so all of the fluid particles. And you can actually middle mouse click over this, and you should see, yep, there it is, 4.862 million points is being processed. So it's close to 5 million particles. It's a little bit too much. It's probably a bit of an overnight process. I think the highest I've probably pushed this up is maybe to 20, 30 million, and that would take probably about 5 to 10 minutes for a single frame, just for the simulation of the physics. And then obviously you have to add rendering time on top of that. So there's still a reason why people have rendering farms. You know, they're not going to vanish, but the new CPU definitely holds up much better than my old one. My old one would struggle hitting 1 million. This one can deal with quite a bit more, but obviously there's going to be an upper limit for everything. Let's come back out and let's jump into the Auto-Dop network, and let's just bring this particle separation back to maybe 0.05. Just for the simulation purposes. Let's come back to the object level, rewind, and let's play this back. And simulating a whole lot faster. And I'm expecting the front as well as the back of my head to essentially be melted away. And I can kind of see, let's see if I can rotate around while this is simulating. Yep, so you can see the back of the head is now also being affected by the heat, and both the front and the back are kind of going to liquefy and melt away. I'm just going to speed up the rest of the simulation so you don't have to wait for it. Cool, the simulation is done. Let me make this a little bit bigger. And we now have an effect of the head melting in the front and the back. This is the very technique that I used to melt my face for the short film in the beginning of this tutorial, but obviously we still need to render this out and composite it into our scene in Adobe After Effects. But because this video is getting pretty long already, I think I'm just going to defer that to a part 2. Just very quickly, if you want to see what your actual surface, the actual object looks like, because right now obviously all we're seeing is particles, you can actually come over at the top here. We're currently in our scene view. There's also animation editor and a bunch of other things. Come up into your render view, and in your render view, simply select render. And Houdini will render this out. Now, 2 things you will notice straight off the bat. For one, the fluid surface is kind of undetailed and blocky. It's just not very nice. In order to add more detail into the look of your surface, you need to decrease your particle separation and therefore increase the number of particles in your scene. However, the more particles you have in your scene, the longer it will take to calculate the simulation and the slower the whole process will be. The other thing you are going to notice is that right now there is no texture. Like my face texture is gone, just a gray blob. And maintaining the texture when you're dealing with fluids is actually a little bit trickier. Well, it's not hard. It just requires more understanding of some of the more lower level fundamentals of Houdini, and I want to cover that in proper detail and not just rush through and then you get all confused and not sure what's going on. So I'd rather move all of that content into a part 2 where we will then refine this animation, actually add my texture on, and then I'll show you how to actually render this out and bring this into After Effects to composite into your final shot. I really hope you enjoyed the first venture into Houdini. Obviously there is going to be a part 2 to this series where we're going to texture, render and composite this effect. But just leave me some comments down below if you want to see some more cool stuff that you can do with Houdini. And that's all there is to it. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Many thanks to Selena, Violet and Jimmy for helping shoot this thing. So go check out their channels and show them some love. If you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up, favorite it, share it with the world. And as always, if you do have any comments, questions or suggestions, anything except about the hat, just leave them down in the section below. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.